This is TWiT.
Twitter is doing some research. Specifically, they're toying with the idea that maybe white supremacists don't belong on their platform. Joining us to discuss whether this is too little, too late is Joseph Cox from Motherboard. Welcome back to the show, Joseph.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
So you spoke to a Twitter executive who pondered whether it was better to deplatform extremists or to engage with them. Did it surprise you that Twitter is asking these questions now?
It didn't surprise me too much, but that's because we've been reporting on Twitter's sort of difference when it comes to content moderation. So you'll have Facebook on one side, and they may be very binary. And it'll be stuff like, should we ban them or should we not? Twitter takes a much more multifaceted approach, and it seems they do try to do research before they then implement policies. And of course, Facebook does that as well, but Twitter is just doing it here. So I wouldn't say surprised. The only thing I would say is that it's a little bit late. And at least that's what the academics that we spoke to told us, that this is something that people have been highlighting for years, that this is an issue that Twitter in particular does need to get behind.
And so those academics, so you put to them what the Twitter executive said, that perhaps they pondered that perhaps it would be better to engage with white supremacists on Twitter. And what did the academics specifically say about the potential success of that?
Yeah, so Twitter has this potential idea that they say anecdotally that there's evidence that if you have a voice there to be debated against, so if you leave a white supremacist up or a white nationalist up, you could expose them to good speech, whatever that may be, or counter speech. Some of the academics we spoke to didn't really agree with that, in part because of counter speech itself. Maybe it's not always going to be effective against people who have such a hard-grained ideology, such as white supremacy or white nationalism. But there's also something about Twitter sort of as a platform, as the way it is designed, which is that you may not be able to get context. It's heavily favored towards people who are over the top and very exaggerated, and you may not actually be able to have a good faith argument on Twitter by the very nature of the platform. Now, if you're trying to do good speech or counter speech, you're only going to do that on the premise that the person actually wants to have a proper debate with you and not just be a racist. So, of course, the actual efficacy of that policy is another question that Twitter is going to have to answer as well in its research. Well, and that is what they're trying to do as well.
And so counter speech, from what you're saying, you might not be so effective on Twitter. I mean, is that what exactly? I'm trying to identify what in a social network would need to exist in order for that to be successful, and what Twitter doesn't have, in other words, for it to work in that way.
So, I mean, the executive didn't go into super specifics on what it may actually look like, but we can kind of look at how Twitter and other platforms have dealt with other subjects. So at the moment, there's been a hell of a lot of media coverage about anti-vax. And now if you go on Twitter and you search for sort of anti-vax memes or even keywords, there'll be a pop-up that says, hey, this information has been disproven or something like that, or please follow this link if you want more information. And there's similar on Instagram, I think, or at least they're going to deploy it, and there is similar on Facebook. So from a product point of view, it may look like that. After an investigation we did recently, Facebook banned white nationalism because it came to the conclusion it was the same as white supremacy, at least ideologically. Now, when you go and search for white nationalism content on Facebook, it will have a pop-up like that. So to answer your question, maybe counter speech on Twitter would look something like that you search for a white nationalist figure or you engage with a white nationalist tweet, and maybe it would come up with a pop-up with more information. Again, that is me just inferring from what other products there are around dealing with similar issues, but you can imagine something like that. But then even more just philosophically with Twitter, they believe that you can't just hide something and it disappears. They believe that there should be something out there to be debated. And again, that is radically different to other social media platforms who don't try to take that philosophical, open, transparent approach, and they more readily just want to ban offending content.
So you write that it's really not in Twitter's benefit to deplatform these individuals. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I would frame that as a view from the academics, in that at least some of them said that, you know, it will be very expensive to start banning more users, because of course you need to hire more moderators, you need to invest in tools, that sort of thing. I personally don't 100% buy that argument. In the conversations we had with other Twitter employees as well, the whole financial argument doesn't really seem to make sense. It really is a philosophical, almost cultural approach at Twitter that does make this different. As for why they may leave them up, I wouldn't say it would be so much deliberate necessarily, but if you look at the moderation of terrorist content, when you have a load of Islamic State accounts or maybe Al-Qaeda accounts, this is going to be a wave of people or accounts that all have the same profile image. For example, it'll be an ISIS flag or something like that. Or when they upload the new Islamic State propaganda, that's very easy to identify because it's largely going to be the same piece of footage. When you're dealing with hate speech, and far-right hate speech is one example of that, it's much more difficult to detect algorithmically at scale. So there is a resource idea there. I'm just not sure if that is the actual reason that Twitter would rather do this, because again, I think that's their culture and that's actually their philosophical approach.
Yeah. Now, talk a little bit about how speech restrictions can sometimes catch the wrong actors. I think it was the EFF's Jillian York mentioned this in the piece. How exactly does that happen?
So, I mean, you may have minority communities. Just for one example, it could be sex workers, let's say, and they could get caught up into certain filters, or maybe policies that are meant to catch one group could inadvertently be biased against someone else. So, sort of to flip it a little bit, we had an article a while ago, which was sort of that explanation I just gave of the terrorism content. The reason that Twitter doesn't do the same sort of approach for hate speech is because when you have that collateral damage, that may also impact Republicans and Trump supporters. That is, I mean, it sounds controversial when you say it, but when you actually think about it, that seems very obvious, that there is always going to be collateral when it comes to deploying some sort of content moderation tool. And then again, in the case of hate speech, it's so difficult to fine tune it that may then impact people who aren't actually the target of that content moderation strategy. And that's going to happen if you try to do it, I don't know, against sexual content, and you're trying to block a load of nudity. You may then end up hitting holiday photos, just for a completely innocuous example. But you could have a similar sort of thing for terrorism and then say hate speech if you try to do the exact same approach. And this is why social media companies do need to do this research, because every single content moderation strategy is going to be different. Every problem has its own nuances, and you do need a different approach for pretty much everything. And of course, that is where all of this problem comes from in the first place.